Moonlight Sonata, or Piano Sonata No. 14 by Beethoven, is a very famous piece, and there are so many reasons as to why it's a well-known piece. The piece was completed in 1801 and was published and first performed in 1802 by Beethoven. When the piece was completed and performed, Beethoven was going deaf. Towards the end of the 1700s, he was almost completely deaf and continued to lose hearing. He found it hard to cope with his hearing loss and avoided being out in public for fear that if people found out that he was deaf, his career would end. During this time in his life, he became very depressed and left Vienna and sought help in Helgenstein. After staying in a village and finding the treatment unsuccessful, he considered committing suicide. These dark years were a turning point in Beethoven's life and music style. After 1802, his music turned to what is known as his second stylistic phase of music. Some people say that the Moonlight Sonata is a symbol of Beethoven finally accepting his hearing loss. The sonata is presumed to be written about Countess Giulietta Guicciardi. She became a student of Beethoven's in 1801, and as their relationship evolved, he fell in love with her. He proposed marriage, but her father didn't want her marrying a musician who was not of rank, money, or power. The name for the sonata was coined after Beethoven's death. In the 1830s, a German romantic poet named Ludwig Rellstab published a review of the piece and said that he likened the first movement of the piece to a boat floating in the moonlight on Switzerland's Lake Lucerne. The sonata is written in C-sharp minor. There are no significant key changes throughout the piece, but he does use accidentals throughout to accent certain parts of the piece. The main theme in the piece is the triplets that are continuous. He expands the triplets throughout the piece and uses them to create the form, and he uses the other parts to layer on top of the triplets. The structure of the piece is ABC. There are two different A and B themes. The first AA phrase begins in measure 1 and continues through measure 4. The first phrase sets the piece into its main theme with the triplet pattern. There are a couple accidentals, but no key change. The chords in the bass accent the triplets in the melody and give an ominous fill to the tune. The next phrase is the AB section, and it begins in measure 5 and continues through measure 15. In this section, Beethoven moves the melody lower and puts a higher voice above the triplets. Towards the end of the section, in measure 12, he moves the triplets down lower into the bass. He uses a dotted 8th and 16th note in the higher voice, and because they don't line up with the triplet, it gives a flam effect. There are a lot of accidentals in this section. The next section is the B section, and it begins in measure 16 and ends at measure 27. This section has more chords in the bass, and the higher notes move more than the previous sections. In measures 16 through 18, the quarter notes in the bass remind me of the music in Jaws. After these measures, I expected a grand change, but instead Beethoven returns to the theme and keeps the notes above the triplets moving. There are more accidentals in this section, and sometimes they seem to conflict with the other sharps in the chords. The next phrase is BB, measures 28 to 31. In this phrase, the higher notes in the triplets cross, and the notes that were above the triplets become part of the triplets, and it gives a different tone to the piece and makes it feel less chaotic, and it seems that he wants the listener to focus on the melody and how it interacts with the triplets, instead of how they fit on top of each other. This is one of my favorite parts of the piece. In measures 30 through 40, the triplets are still present, but they have a different sequence of notes instead of the step increments that ascend. The melody changes and gives the piece tension. The next phrase is BC, and is measures 32 through 42. Measure 32 is a drastic change, and the triplets start in the bass, and the melodic steps up are dissonant. The notes seem more accented and heavy. The triplets move upwards, and the first few measures of this section are focused only on the triplets. The chords underneath them make them stand out more and makes this section dark and powerful. There are a lot of accidentals in this section, and he wanted the accidentals to stand out. This section reminds me of someone having a nightmare, and the triplets that are ascending are the nightmare. When the triplets descend, the nightmare becomes less frightening, but when the triplets ascend again, the nightmare becomes more intense. In measures 38 through 42, Beethoven switches the top treble clef line into a bass clef line and then switches it back. This section is the climax of the piece. The last section is C, and it is measure 60 to the end. Beethoven moves the higher voice under the triplets into the bass. In measures 62 through 67, the triplets move and melody changes like it did in measures 30 through 40, and it gives the melody tension and then releases at the end. The end of the piece winds down and gives the listener a sense of uneasiness but closure.